And if we're, let's see, not quite 5:15. Guess we should go ahead and start the recording. Okay.
Time, Mr. Batchelor?
It is 5:15. No, not quite 5:15. Now it's 5:15.
This is the March 15th, 2022 meeting of the City of Charleston Board of Zoning Appeals. Zoning. Present are Mr. Morrison, Mr. Judon, Ms. Grass, Ms. Richards, Mr. Bennett, and Mr. Robinson. Present from the planning staff are Mr. Batchelor, Ms. Ashby, and Mr. Valentine. These proceedings are being recorded, and we ask that those who speak identify themselves for the record. We'll conduct this meeting in usual fashion. We'll first receive information from city staff about the application and their recommendation. If the recommendation is favorable and no one objects to the application, usually the Board of Zoning Appeals treats the matter as being uncontested and passes it as a matter of course. If, however, the city recommends against the application or there is opposition to the application, we treat the application as contested and hear from the applicant and anyone else who is in favor of the application. Next, we hear from anyone opposed, followed by a short rebuttal from the applicant. We then close the public hearing portion of the meeting for that particular application and open discussion to the Board of Zoning Appeals members only. We'll then make a decision to approve with conditions, or deny the application. The Board of Zoning Appeals zoning has the authority to do three things. First, to hear appeals to decisions of the zoning administrator. Second, to grant special exceptions, a fact-finding function of the board. And third, to grant variances to the zoning ordinance if the application meets the hardship test outlined in section 54-924 of the ordinance. The board may deliberate and make a final decision on a matter by a majority vote of members present at the hearing and qualified to vote, provided that not less than a quorum is present and qualified to vote. However, an affirmative vote of 2/3 of the board members present and voting shall be required before a use variance may be granted. For a variance to be granted, the Board of Zoning Appeals must make the following findings. A, that there are extraordinary and exceptional conditions pertaining to the particular piece of property. B, these conditions do not generally apply to other property in the vicinity. C, because of these conditions, the application of the ordinance to the particular piece of property would effectively prohibit or unreasonably restrict the utilization of the property. And D, the authorization of a variance will not be of substantial detriment to adjacent property or to the public good, and the character of the district will not be harmed by the granting of the variance. I'd like to lead off the meeting by announcing Mr. Batchelor has already made some comments about it. I'll be not on the board anymore. My time is up and my term in office is expired. And after 30-something years, the city has agreed to pay me a wonderful severance and a really hefty pension. So I'm going to take advantage of that and move off into the sunset. And I've enjoyed very much working with each of you and the city staff as well. That being said, we'll lead into the meeting. The first item on the agenda is a review of the minutes of the March 1st, 2022 board meeting. Everyone should have been mailed email or mail copies of those minutes. And are there any comments or additions, deletions, or motions for those minutes? Mr. Morrison moves for approval, seconded by Mr. Judon to accept the minutes. All in favor signify by saying aye. Mr. Morrison?
Aye.
Mr. Judon?
Aye.
Ms. Grass?
I cannot vote because I wasn't present.
Good call, you're right. Ms. Richards?
Aye.
Mr. Bennett?
Aye.
Mr. Robinson votes aye. The motion is unanimously approved. Second item on the agenda is 262 Captain Goodard Wharton Road, Daniel Island. Request a variance from section 54-263 Daniel Island PUD Master Plan zoning regulations to allow a bridge to encroach up to 5 feet into a 10-foot visual buffer zone setback. Bridge is for vehicle access to a proposed single-family residence, zone DI-RI. Mr. Batchelder.
This is a residential lot on Daniel Island. And as you can see, it has a very, very unusual shape. And it came before this request came before the board maybe a couple months ago, and is now back in front of you with some additional information. So here's the zoning map just showing the location of the property, the fact that it's zoned Daniel Island Residential Island, which is a specific zoning district to Daniel Island. Here's an aerial view looking from the north, I think, at the lot. So it's on the Wando River side of Daniel Island in a new section. The applicant was filed back in January and was deferred by the board back in, I guess it would have been in mid-February, with a request that the applicant should gain approval of their proposed bridge connection that was requiring the variance in front of the board, that they should gain approval for that from the Daniel Island Architectural Review Board. And they have since done that. So they have requested that this be placed back in front of you for your consideration. So here's a survey of a lot, and there's an image later on that will clearly show all the restrictions that apply to this property. So I'll skip to that. These are other slides that show the views of the property, different locations, and more views of the island, or of this lot, rather. More information. And this is a site plan just showing what the proposed house footprint would look like with the accessory building up by the street and the driveway providing access for vehicles back to the house. And here's the slide that has the image that I think is much very helpful to explain the restrictions. So on Daniel Island, we have a zoning requirement that's unique to that part of the city, and it is a visual buffer zone. When the city annexed and zoned Daniel Island in about 1990, well, the early 90s, we adopted a visual buffer zone requirement for lots that abut the marsh. And the idea was that the tree canopies and the vegetation that existed around the perimeter of the island should be preserved as it's developed, so that we don't end up with manicured lawns extending right down to the critical line, that we retain that natural vegetation, natural edge to the island. So the visual buffer zone is a 25-foot or a 20-foot strip of land that runs around the perimeter of the island. And that is shown with this lighter color of green. Let me turn on my laser pointer. Okay, so this lighter color of green is a 20-foot visual buffer zone. And then beyond that, we also adopted a 10-foot building setback from that visual buffer zone, again, to help preserve the vegetation within that buffer zone. And that is shown by both the lighter, the slightly darker shade of green and the dark shade of green. That's those two strips combined equal 10 feet. Also, there is a 25-foot OCRM buffer, and that is a landscape buffer requirement that was imposed by the South Carolina DHEC Office of Coastal Resource Management in order to protect that 25-foot strip around the perimeter of this part of the island. Those are typically imposed on specific parts of the island as it was developed under certain circumstances. If there were requests that were submitted to and approved by OCRM for filling or altering any wetlands. So they would say, okay, we'll allow that, but we want a 25-foot visual buffer or 25-foot buffer around the perimeter of the island. And so that is shown by the lighter green, the slightly darker shade of green, that's 25 feet. So that leaves that darkest shade of green, that 5-foot inner strip of land that is the remaining portion of that 10-foot building setback, visual buffer zone setback, that that does offer some flexibility to the homeowners. Some things are allowed to be built in that visual buffer zone setback, and they're proposing to build a bulkhead wall in a part of the visual buffer zone setback. That does not require your approval. That is permitted by the standards in the zoning ordinance. However, the bridge in this location at the choke point between the two critical lines, that does require your approval because that is a structure that encroaches into the building setback. And the encroachment is 5 feet. So they have to stay out of that OCRM 25-foot buffer, but they're proposing to encroach 5 feet into the city's 10-foot building setback from the visual buffer zone. And in this case, I think there's a clear argument that there is no other way to do this, no other option for them, given the odd shape of this property. There's no other way to provide that driveway access out to the house. So that is their request in a nutshell. And another slide here. This is a enlarged version, just highlighting, making it easier to read this section of the plan. And then here's just a diagram illustrating what that bridge will look like in the top section. And then here is the email that we received recently from Mary Stewart Sutton, who heads up the Architectural Review Board for the Daniel Island Property Owners Association. And as she indicates here, the ARB supports the concept of the variance for the encroachment into that 10-foot visual buffer zone setback for the bridge. They haven't approved the architectural plans for the house, but they do support the concept of the variance for the bridge. So, and they have reviewed that. So I think that's what we were looking for, and the applicant has gone back and obtained that information from the ARB. So I think they've satisfied that request. And again, going back to the plan, I don't see any other option for them. They have a right to build out here. And so I don't see any other option for them to provide that vehicular access up to the house other than to go through that one section there. To do any other, put it anywhere else would be going through marsh, which would clearly not be allowed. So, so we recommend approval of this request.
City recommends approval. Ms. Ashby, is there any opposition?
No, Mr. Robinson, no opposition.
Mr. Judon moves for approval, seconded by Ms. Grass. All in favor signify by saying aye.
I actually have some questions if I could ask them, Mr. Robinson.
Yes, ma'am, please.
Okay, sorry about that. I just wanted to just make sure that I'm understanding exactly what we're approving, because when I looked over the application, the applicant talks more about that development of the lot is impossible due to the restrictive covenants, and that the restrictive covenants wouldn't allow fill on the island, and that and they also say this lot is a prime example on why a variance to the restrictive covenants is necessary. So I just want to make sure, because a lot of the application was about the site constraints for building and not for the bridge. So I just want to make sure that we're not approving something that might be interpreted that we're approving the actual building site. And I may be way off, but it seemed like more information was presented in their application about the actual where the house is going to be built, unless I'm misunderstanding, instead of the bridge.
I think it, in the application, as read into the minutes, it's to allow a bridge to encroach 5 feet. It's very specific about what they're asking here in the application.
Right. And I also saw in the letter from the Daniel Island board that they remarked that they are not, that their approval is only for the bridge and not, for the specific lot. And so I'm just wondering if the board, if we should maybe note that we're approving just the bridge, since the application was geared more towards the site not being developable due to the restrictive covenants. I mean, maybe we don't need to, but I'm just trying to clarify.
I feel comfortable myself, but if you wish to approach the board members to see if they want to amend the motion in the second, that's fine. The application states only allow the bridge to encroach. That's all it says.
Right. Well, can Mr. Batchelder address it, please?
Well, yeah, we're just dealing with the bridge. The house is a separate application process. They'll have to go back to the Daniel Island ARB and satisfy them before they can even submit their plans to the city for approval.
Okay. So whatever we approve does not automatically say that we're approving the development. It's just this bridge.
That's correct. And in fact, when I look at this plan, I see there's what looks like a grand tree right here. It's labeled as a grand tree. And, that's something that will have to be studied. It looks like they're staying out of the tree protection zone with the construction. Sometimes limbs on these grand oaks can be a little bit odd when they're growing next to the marsh. They can grow off in different directions. So, we'll need to take a close look at that and make sure that tree is not going to be impacted by the proposed improvements and fill with this project. And that might require some sort of approval through the other Board of Zoning Appeals that deals with tree protection. But no, the house improvements, building improvements on this lot, for that way would have to go back to the Daniel Island ARB. And we don't even review plans for approval. The city doesn't review plans for approval on Daniel Island without a stamp of approval from the Daniel Island ARB. So we know before we ever start reviewing a set of plans that the ARB has already reviewed it and approved it for their covenants.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Let's see if that has legs. All in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye. Mr. Morrison. Was that an aye?
Yes, aye.
Thank you. Mr. Jadon,
Aye.
Ms. Grass,
I would rather have not seconded that motion, please. Sorry, I hate to be going back and forth, but
oh, you did the initial second?
I didn't. You said that I seconded it, and I'd like to not second it, please.
Okay, I'm very sorry. I didn't pick up on that. Okay, a motion was made for approval. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Seconded by Mr. Morrison. All in favor signify by saying aye. Mr. Morrison,
Aye.
Mr. Jadon,
Aye.
Ms. Grass,
Aye.
Ms. Richards,
Aye.
Mr. Bennett.
Aye.
Mr. Robinson votes aye. The motion is unanimously approved. It's one of the benefits of doing Zoom. It's difficult to know exactly who's talking. Thank you very much. Item number B1, 1 Simmons Street, North Central. Request a use variance from section 54-203 to allow a storage and repair facility for pedicabs, bikes in a DR2F diverse residential zone district. Mr. Batchelder.
This is an unusual property in the North Central neighborhood. It's a residentially zoned property, but it is not a residential building. It's not been used that way perhaps ever in its history of existing, but you see its location here on Simmons Street, right next to the right-of-way for I-26 and the railroad. And here's a zoning map that shows that the property has a DR2F residential zoning on it, as does all of the surrounding properties. Now, along King Street, you do get into commercially zoned properties, but this property sits well back from King Street. And my guess is that it was constructed originally as a warehouse or some sort of industrial facility in connection with the railroad, which ran right by the front of it. So you can see on this zoning map, this curved strip of land that bisects two blocks. That is a former railroad right-of-way. So one of the railroad lines that came through Charleston came down the center of the peninsula and then curved and went down through Wagner Terrace and through the Citadel and across the Ashley River and through the neighborhoods in West Ashley. So that railroad was abandoned long ago, but this building, which probably goes back to that era, still exists, and it's been used for a variety of light industrial, commercial activities as long as I've known about it. But the request today is to put a sort of a storage facility warehouse for a bike, pedestrian, bike, pedicab bike facility. So here's an aerial view showing the building. You see it's a one-story building with a paved gravel yard out in front of it. And then the application was filed, and here are the applicants' explanations, part of the record that was available before the meeting. And So the use is not a residential use clearly, but that's not a residential building. And we felt like it was important for this application to go through the board. These types of uses have coming and going, I guess, for the storage of the bikes, and they operate later into the night and that sort of thing. So we want to make sure that the applicant contacted the neighborhood association and the neighbors up there and made them aware of it. But the buildings had a variety of uses. It, for a while, was the shop for the Clemson Architecture Center, which has that label down in the corner. That was a shop. They have a wood shop and other kinds of facilities to build things. And that was located in this building. And then there have been other users up here too. So it's had a variety of history, variety of uses. So anyway, more information. So we have information from the neighborhood association. The applicant really did a great job of communicating with the neighbors and the neighborhood association and gaining support, getting letters for this use from those people. And here's a letter from the president of the North Central Neighborhood Association indicating that they support this. Also, the chairman, co-chairman of the Friends of the Low Line, Tom Bradford, and other folks who have property up in that area or live up in that area. And, and these were all part of the record that was available online. The applicant submitted these with their application. So anyway, there's a lot of support. And we think that the use is appropriate for that building, given its history and the type of building it is. So I'm just going to quickly go through these. You can see there's Simmons Street, King Street, Poplar Street, and Fields Place. So duplicates, and then Romney Street. And more photographs showing the building. So that's concludes the presentation, but my recommendation is for approval of this use variance, and this does require a 2/3 vote of the board.
Mr. Batchelder, would this be classified as an intensification?
Well, I think it's similar to some of the other uses that have been there in the past. I think we had an approval from years ago for some sort of warehouse use, although I don't recall exactly. But there have been other users in here, and some of them were fine, and some of them maybe were not appropriate, and we didn't allow them. But I think this is probably a little bit more active use in some ways, because you have bicycles coming and going, but it is also adjacent to the low line. And eventually that low line area will be improved, and there'll be a direct connection for folks up here to use that low line to access the lower peninsula without going to streets. Out to King Street, for instance. So anyway, I think it's a good use for this property, given its location in the low line, and it's appropriate for the building.
Very good. City recommends approval. Ms. Ashby, is there any opposition?
No, Mr. Robinson, no opposition.
Are there any questions or comments from the board? Hearing none, Mr. Jadon moves for approval, seconded by Ms. Grass. All in favor signify by saying aye. Mr. Morrison?
Aye.
Mr. Jadon?
Aye.
Ms. Grass?
Aye.
Ms. Richards?
Aye.
Mr. Bennett?
Aye.
Mr. Robinson votes aye. The motion is unanimously approved. Next item on the agenda is item number 2, 54 Line Street, Cannonboro, Elliottboro. Request a special exception under section 54-207(1)(e) to allow an existing tower to be relocated from 52 Line Street. Proposed location for tower is visible from a property listed in the National Register of Historic Places, zoned light industrial. Mr. Batchelder.
This is another unusual request because we're dealing with communication tower, which is not something we normally ever see at the board. But I'll explain why this one has to go before the board in just a minute. So we're talking about this parcel of land just north of Line Street and accessed off King Street. And it's adjacent to Highway 17, where it crosses over King Street and curves to become Interstate 26. It's also adjacent to the former railroad right-of-way, which is located directly east of the property. And on that right-of-way today, former railroad right-of-way is a tower, a communications tower that was built probably about 15 years ago or so. And that tower will be phased out, and the carriers that are operating on that cell tower will be relocated to the new tower on this property that's shown on the map. And that is the nature of the request before you tonight. So here's an aerial view, and this property over here is now owned by the city. It's part of the future low line area. It was railroad right of way, and that will become a park, a linear park, basically, that will provide a path, alternate path for people to access the lower and upper peninsulas. And it will become a park amenity space as well. But before that happens, some things have to happen. And one of those things was the relocation of a billboard, which did occur. And that's already finished. The last part of this major relocation effort is to relocate this cell tower from this location here, where it was basically a leased parcel from the railroad, and relocate that onto this property where this green pin is. This tower was built about 15 years ago, like I said, and it may be one of the more expensive towers ever built because it had this ground floor building constructed around the tower to house all the equipment. And it was done in a kind of reminiscent of a roundhouse, a railroad roundhouse, because of the location of this property. And the National Register of Historic Places building that is individually listed is the railroad building over here, just off this slide. You can't see it, but it's a structure that relates back to the railroad when it came down the peninsula all the way down to I guess Ann Street and John Street down there. Actually, and I didn't realize this originally, but the original passenger station was on Line Street, right about here. And that building was torn down sometime in the mid to early 20th century. But that was where the railroad station was. this was a big shop building that still exists. That tower, that chimney on that property was part of that railroad shop building. And then there were other facilities up here as well that are part of that National Register listing. But the tower is what we're dealing with tonight, the relocation to a new location on this property. Here's a zoning map. So we've zoned this future development parcel where that existing tower is located to allow the future development of that property. And then you see the subject property where the new tower will be built is zoned light industrial. The applicant filed their paperwork. Now, one of the things that I just added this slide into this presentation just to make it clear why this matter is coming before the board, because we must have, I don't know, 20 or 30, maybe more communications towers in the city of Charleston that have been built since the cell communications explosion in the 90s. And I think the board has probably seen 2 of those towers. I don't think there were any more that came before the board. The existing tower at this location is one of those 2 towers that the board saw years ago because of the National Register listed property next door. And the other one is on James Island. And again, that involved the visibility of that particular tower from a National Register district. So anyway, the language in the ordinance that we adopted way back in the 90s said that it listed all the staff approval criteria, the conditions that would have to be met in order for us to staff approve towers. And in virtually all those cases where we've got towers today, those towers met those criteria. The staff was able to approve them. And that's how we ended up with what we have today. But if the tower can't meet all of those criteria, those staff approval criteria, then it has to come before the board and be approved by the board as an exception, subject to a finding that the tower satisfies the special exception criteria listed in this section of the code. So the letter that was filed by the applicant references all those conditions, but it didn't include that language that I just had on that slide. And I just wanted to make sure that it was clear as to why the board was dealing with this particular application. So these are all the staff approval criteria. It meets all of these criteria except for this particular one, the subsection E, which states that the proposed tower must not be visible from property listed in the National Register of Historic Places. And because of that building, that railroad shop building next door on Line Street, it's clearly visible from that building. So we couldn't give our staff approval to this location. Then it goes on. And when you get to this part, it says you've got to meet these other criteria for if it comes before the board has to find that it meets these additional criteria. So the design, location, and height of the proposed tower will not substantially impact, 1, the aesthetic and residential character of the adjoining areas, zoned residential or conservation, and intended to remain as such under the adopted land use plans. And 2, the character of the property listed in the National Register of Historic Places or roads and rivers, which have been officially designated as scenic roads or rivers. So we're looking to determine, the board is looking to determine whether the design, location, and height will substantially impact those areas. And in our opinion, this does not. So, and if I could just explain a little bit more, these facilities have to go through an extensive review and approval process that involves not just local government, but also the federal government. So, or the state government. So in this case, this one did go through the State Historic Preservation Office. And it did receive their approval, just as the previous tower received their approval. So that's a pretty conclusive review, I think, for impacts on historic properties. And they include in their exhibits here an email that states that, and I'll run through these other exhibits as well. But so these are the plans just showing the proposed tower. Typical of any submittal, it includes a lot of detailed drawings. And so you see the tower location right here. All of the equipment for the carriers on the tower will be located here on the ground. Zoning map. So you see here the distances from the residentially zoned areas of the city. So talking about 787 feet to the east, 835 to the west side neighborhood, and it's like 751 feet to the closest residentially zoned property in Cannon Borough, Elliott Borough. A detailed drawing of the site and the proposed improvements. There's also a billboard that is on this property that will remain. This is an elevation showing the height of 112 feet, which is permitted by the zoning ordinance. That's the maximum height that is permitted based on the old city height districts that apply to this property. And this is designed for 3 carriers, I guess, because there are 3 locations right here. That's typical of the towers. It will be enclosed by this brick wall. And then there's a letter from the structural engineer just documenting that the fall zone for this tower does not impact any adjoining properties or the street. And that's, again, that's a requirement that they have to provide, and they all do. And here's a letter that just indicates the SHPO approval. And the applicant is on the call if anyone has any questions about these documents. And then photographs of the site. See the existing tower and the facility right there, that will be removed once all the carriers have been transferred over to the new tower. The building right here. Okay, that's yeah, this is looking back to the site where the tower would go. More photos. This is a photo just showing a simulation of what that tower will look like when it's completed. The tower on the right is an old technology. It was done in a way to make it look very to minimize the impact of the tower, so you don't see all the antennas attached to the outside of that tower. That doesn't work with the new 5G technology, and so this tower has these shrouds around the antennas that would be placed on that pole. Another view from King Street. And one more view. So this is looking from King Street north of Highway 17. And more information. So that concludes the presentation. So the previous tower went through the same process and was approved, and this one we think should be approved as well. We think it meets the requirements and the special exception criteria. So our recommendation is for approval. And we haven't received any objections or concerns from anybody about this location. There are other reasons why this is important as a location for a cell tower, and the applicants can explain that if you have any questions about that. But and just generally speaking, the city's regulations for cell towers encourage these to go within these commercial and industrial areas away from residential areas. And typically that's how it's done. And it's worked pretty well. And this is certainly a commercial and industrial area that is probably suitable for this type of thing versus putting it in a neighborhood. So we recommend approval.
City recommends approval. And Mr. Batchelor, you said there's no opposition.
That's correct.
Does anyone on the board have any questions or comments? Motion for approval made by Ms. Grass, seconded by Ms. Richards. All in favor signify by saying aye. Mr. Morrison,
Aye.
Mr. Judon,
Aye.
Ms. Grass,
Aye.
Ms. Richards,
Aye.
Ms. Bennett, Mr. Bennett, how about that? Mr. Bennett.
Aye.
Mr. Robinson votes aye. The motion is unanimously approved. Next item is number 3, 2003 Cherry Hill Lane. Request a special exception under section 54-206, parentheses U, to utilize 1.38 acres of heavy industrial zone acreage toward the allowable multifamily residential dwelling unit density on general business zone portion of the property. 1.38 acres equals 26 dwelling units. Parentheses BZA-Z approval required to use HI and zone property for residential use. Zone GB-/HI. Mr. Batchelor.
So another unusual type of request to come before the board, but the property we're dealing with here is in the neck area of the peninsula. It's a property that is mostly zoned general business, but there is a portion on the north end that's zoned heavy industrial. And our zoning district, or our zoning ordinance rather, includes a provision that says that for a heavy industrial property to have residential units on it, the Board of Zoning Appeals has to approve those units. So residential is allowed in heavy industrial zoning districts. I think that's probably a carryover from years ago when we had more heavy industrially zoned property in the lower part of the peninsula. We don't have so much today, but that provision remains. And so for them to take advantage of any residential density that they might obtain in that heavy industrially zoned area, they have to come before the board and seek your approval. So this is the zoning map, and you can see the property. Probably 3/4 of the property, or more than 3/4 of the property, is zoned general business. And then there's this one little area on the north end zoned heavy industrial. The aerial photograph shows the property, and you can see it's just a large yard basically. and a couple buildings on it today. And the surrounding properties. And most of these uses are commercial and light industrial uses. Really, probably the closest heavy industrial use would be over here, where you see the North Charleston sewage treatment plant, and then the concrete products manufacturing area over here, east of the subject property, several hundred feet. But most of the immediate areas is occupied by commercial uses and light industrial types of uses. There's a small little pocket of a neighborhood right here called 4 Mile. And there are some homes in there. I assume that there are some of those are probably still used as residential properties. Those have been there for many years. So here's the application material and the special exception request from the applicant. So they have 1.3 acres of their property zoned heavy industrial. And on that property, using the maximum allowed density of residential units permitted by the zoning ordinance for heavy industrial, that translates into 26.72 units that they would like to add to the 111.41 units that are permitted on the general business tract. That will give them a total of 138 residential units on that property. They also, as you indicated here, propose to develop all those residential units on the GB zone portion of the property. So they would not develop any residential units on the heavy industrial zoned area. And just, I would say, generally speaking, the heavier types of industrial, the more intensive types of industrial uses are up here on the north end along Cherry Hill Lane versus the south end where the GB zone portion is, just as a general comment. They do intend to develop the heavy industrial zone property that they own for a self-storage facility, which is allowed in a GB zone property as well, but it's a little bit easier to build in a heavy industrial zone property. So that's where they intend to put that. And then they've submitted other exhibits showing their proposal. Again, this is a zoning map and aerial view. This is an illustration of their zoning on that property and the surrounding uses as well. So the city does own this large property over here to the east. And I think intends to relocate its storage yard and vehicle maintenance area and parking lot for all the heavy equipment that it operates over to that area someday. This is the language in the ordinance that applies to this situation. So the dwellings in the heavy industrial district shall be permitted as an exception where the board, after review, finds that there shall not be created any unsafe living conditions given the existing uses in the area. So again, we really don't think there are truly heavy industrial uses in the immediate area of the property that would create any unsafe living conditions. We're concerned about the future of the property to the east that the city owns and the potential impacts that the city facility over there on that industrially zoned property might have on these future residential units. So our recommendation is for approval of their request to allow them to take advantage of those 26.72 dwelling units that they are otherwise entitled to on the heavy industrial property to be built on that GB zone portion of the property. And in exchange for that, we would like them to construct a buffer, a 25-foot buffer along this side of the property within the general business zone portion of their property. So the other thing about that is that there's a street right of way, Harmon Street, that comes up and I think it may end somewhere about this location right here, but that has no zoning on it. And we just think that it would be appropriate to have that buffer here adjacent to that east side of the property to help minimize the potential impact from the uses that will eventually go over here on this large heavy industrial zone property that the city owns. And I've been in communications with the applicant, and they have agreed to construct a 25-foot landscape buffer on that east side of the property. And that would be within that, again, that's within the GB zone portion of the property, not the heavy industrial zone portion where the self-storage would go, but the GB zone portion where the residential units would be built. So with that condition, our recommendation is for approval of this request.
City recommends approval with the 25-foot buffer condition. Ms. Ashby, is there any opposition?
No, Mr. Robinson, no opposition.
Are there any questions of Mr. Batchelor on this application from the board?
I have two quick questions. I think they'll be quick, if you'll permit me. Mr. Batchelor, will the access to the residences be through the Herbert Street entrance, or I'm sorry, the Harmon Street entrance on the south side?
Well, I believe the owners of this property also own one of these pieces coming out to King Street.
Okay.
Or Meeting Street, rather, Meeting Street. And I believe that's the case. We can ask one of those applicants. I see Brian Riley on the phone or on the call today. We can ask him to join the meeting and he could answer that question if you'd like.
I would like to, and before I do, one other question for you: would the approval of the various elements of the buffer go before the site design zoning board, or is that subject to just staff? I'm just curious what elements would be required in the buffer.
Well, we talked about were canopy trees going in that buffer, and the plans, I don't believe would have to go through the Board of Zoning Appeals site design unless there are trees issues that I'm not aware of or other site issues that may require that. Instead, it will have to go through the technical review committee of the city, and we will scrutinize a landscape plan for that when that happens. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I would like to know just briefly if the applicant could let us know exactly how they intend to enter the property. I think that'd be helpful.
And so we promoted Brian Riley to be a panelist. Brian, are you with us?
Yes, sir, Lee. I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, this is Brian Riley with Thomas.
Brian, hold on a minute, please, sir. Would you please allow Mr. Batchelor to swear you in?
Yes, sir.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, sir, I do.
Please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, yes, Brian Riley with Thomas and Hutton representing the applicant on this application. And as Lee mentioned in response to Mr. Bennett's question, the redevelopment intent here is to include assemble some of the additional properties there to the southwest that abut Meeting Street. And so the overall redevelopment intent would be to access off of Meeting Street primarily for the residential. And there would be access off of Cherry Hill Lane into the industrial, but you could get all the way through the site.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. You've answered my question.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from the board?
I have one for Mr. Batchelder. Just to verify, the property that's owned by the city will, nothing will be, I guess that this development won't preclude any heavy industrial development on that property? Is that what you're saying?
No, it certainly wouldn't preclude the heavy industrial development over there, but we're just wanting to make sure that there's some sort of a buffer between the apartments and the future yard and whatever happens in that other property there. It's labeled Low Country Stone Solutions.
Right.
You can see that right of way coming up here. It's just a strip of land, comes up to the back of that property. So that doesn't have a zoning on it right now. And so that's the purpose. And 25 feet is really not much, but it's something, and we think that would be beneficial.
Okay, thank you. And then my other question for you is, whatever is developed on that property, will the residential uses be considered when planning that development, do you think? To make sure that they're not negatively impacted?
On the city's portion?
Yes.
You know, I can't speak to that because I won't be involved in that process. I don't think there are any immediate plans to do anything. I think this was a purchase by the city to secure a piece of property when the time came and they needed to move, they had a place to move to. I think all the existing facilities are over on the west side of the peninsula off of Milford Street, and those are going to have to move at some point.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions from the board? Are there any motions?
Move approval.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor signify by saying aye. Mr. Morrison,
Aye.
Mr. Jadon,
Aye.
Ms. Grass,
Aye.
Ms. Richards,
Aye.
Mr. Bennett,
Aye.
Mr. Robinson votes aye. The motion is unanimously approved. Thank you very much.
With the city's recommended condition with the buffer.
With the recommended conditions, absolutely, of a 25-foot landscape buffer on the east side. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next item is item number 4. Ms. Richards will recuse. 90 Cannon Street, Cannon Borough, Elliott Borough. Request a special exception under section 54-511 to allow restaurant use first floor with 700 square feet of inside patron use area, 260 square feet of patio of outside patron use area without providing required off-street parking spaces. 9 spaces required, zone limited business. Mr. Batchelder.
90 Cannon Street is a commercial property in the Cannonboro, Elliottboro neighborhood. It contains a 2-story building. Property is located just west or just east of Rutledge Avenue on the north side of Cannon. And this aerial view shows that 2-story building. It has a storefront on the front of it. So clearly it was used in the past as mixed use or commercial use. And I think probably had a residence upstairs. And there is no off-street parking associated with this property. Application materials, the explanation, which I will skip through and get right to the building. So here are images of the existing building. You can see that storefront. It's been there for many years. Survey of the property. There's this is a joint passage, so this doesn't go with this property over here. So this is the existing footprint. And what you have is a two-story building up here, this location, and then a one-story section back here on the back of the building. And then a large yard in the back. And what they would like to do is make this one-story section 2 stories, add a two-story addition to the back of the existing building, and then create an outdoor patio dining area in that backyard. So the property is owned limited business, like most all of the properties on Cannon Street and Spring Street. And the commercial use is permitted. The residential use upstairs is permitted. The only issue that we're dealing with is really parking. So this is just showing the existing floor plan and proposed floor plan. So the ground floor gets larger with that addition. And what was a space that was chopped up in the smaller offices will be made into a larger space, as you can see. And then one door from the front will provide access to the upper floor as it does now. Then there'll be a new door over here for accessing the ground floor. And then second floor, you can see it was fairly small. This will be a larger second floor with a residential unit up here, 4-bedroom residential unit and a small deck on the back overlooking that yard. Then the storefront will be improved dramatically from what it was. I think more architecturally appropriate with what's proposed here. And of course, that will have to go through and be approved by the BAR, but be a nice restoration along Cannon Street. And side view, you see the existing building on the top and the proposed building down here with the addition. So all of these changes end up, and the proposed uses require 9 parking spaces that they can't provide on site because of their inability to provide access to that rear yard. And they have, as they indicated in their letter, have looked and cannot find any off-street parking available for lease in the area. And I think that's pretty much the case now. There's been so much that's happened up in this area. You have Cannon Green, commercial property right down the street from this that extends from Spring Street all the way through to Cannon Street and has event spaces within it. And they have a parking lot in this block, but it's for their use and not for other people. But other opportunities are pretty much gone now because there's been so much redevelopment and development that has occurred up in this area of the neighborhood. So they just simply don't have any options. They have approached the neighborhood association, and they have obtained the support of the neighborhood association And I think I forgot to put the letter in this presentation from Marion Hawkins. No, here it is. Okay, good. So here's the letter from Marion Hawkins, the president of the Cannon-Borough Borough neighborhood, just indicating that they discussed this at their February meeting, and that they voted unanimously to support the applicant's request to allow a restaurant without required parking. So our recommendation is for approval. We, again, think that this is an excellent use for the building, and we recommend approval of it to you.
City recommends approval. Ms. Ashby, is there any opposition?
No, Mr. Robinson, no opposition.
Any questions from the board? Mr. Bennett moves for approval, seconded by Mr. Morrison. All in favor signify by saying aye. Mr. Morrison,
Aye.
Mr. Jadon,
Aye.
Ms. Grass,
Aye.
Mr. Bennett,
Aye.
Mr. Robinson votes aye. The motion is unanimously approved. Next item on the agenda is 698 Rutledge Avenue, North Central. Request a use variance from section 54-203 to allow retail uses, first floor, and an office use, second floor, in a DR-1F diverse residential zone district. Request a special exception under section 54-511 to allow 3,928 square feet of retail space and 2,252 square feet of office space without providing off-street parking spaces. 15 spaces required, zone DR1F. Mr. Batchelder.
So this is a building, another building that's been underutilized for years up in the North Central neighborhood, abutting Hampton Park. And we have an application now to fix it up and put it back into use. And it's really nice to see, because this building has been sitting here in sort of a minimal use going on for a while, but it's in need of some tender loving care, and it looks like it's finally going to get it. So here is the location of the building on the corner of Rutledge and Cleveland Street. When I show you the image, you'll immediately recognize it, I'm sure, if you've driven up there. But this is a aerial view of the building. You see Hampton Park across Rutledge Avenue, and two-story building. Here's a view from the street. Obviously a commercial building when it was built, or mixed-use corner store type building. Originally, I guess it was built in the 40s, and it was a pharmacy on the ground floor and 2 apartments upstairs. It's residentially zoned. That's kind of interesting that it was zoned this way, given the type of building it is, but nevertheless, that is what it is. So any commercial use of the building, and it hadn't really been used commercially in a while, so any new commercial use in this building is going to require a use variance from the Board of Zoning Appeals. And that is the nature of the request before you, along with parking. Of course, you can see from this image right here that the building pretty much occupies the entire property. If I go back to this, there's no room for any off-street parking. There's a gate right here, and I guess a walkway, but that's not a driveway for vehicles. That's not wide enough. And there's no space coming off of Cleveland Street. So there's simply no room for off-street parking on this property. So the request is to allow this building to be renovated and reused with a ground floor retail use and second floor office use. Both those types of uses require your approval as use variances. And then the parking requirements are such that they need a special exception to not provide the 15 spaces that are required for those uses. Here's the applicant's information, more information from the applicant. And I'll just go through these quickly. These are floor plans showing what they would propose to do. Retail on the ground floor. And existing second floor, proposed second floor. Roof. It's an interesting looking building. It's unique, I think, is a good way to put it. Photographs of the existing building. And it looks like it is, you see windows that don't exist anymore. And, you know, it really needs some attention. And then on the back of the building, you can see a lot of deterioration that's occurred over the years. So great that somebody's investing in this. So our recommendation is for approval. And I think there was a owner of the property next door on Cleveland Street who was concerned about this and expressed those concerns to us. But I really think the proposed uses they couldn't come up with a better mix of uses to lessen the impact to the neighbors. Because if you put residential units up on that second floor, you'd have the people, the occupants of those units parking on the street all evening and all night and all weekend or most of the weekend. So they might not be there in the daytime on the weekdays, but they would be, there would be cars there otherwise. And so office uses tend to generate parking demands on the weekdays, not in the evenings or weekends. And retail uses probably would have a lot of walk-up traffic and even that would probably be minimal and certainly not be there in the evenings and on the weekends too much. So I think that the type of uses they're proposing are actually beneficial. And they certainly have to be able to use the building in some way, and any use you put there is going to require parking. So anyway, and the other great thing about this location is they've got Cleveland Street, the entrance to Hampton Park right across the street. And I know I typically will park here if I go up to another business that's located just up the street from this. And I've never had a problem finding a place to park. So it's nice that they, you know, it's a good location with lots of on-street parking nearby, hopefully not impacting the neighbors too much. So my recommendation is for approval, and they did contact the neighborhood association. And here's a text message from the president of the North Central Neighborhood Association, Ms. Jenkins, Ms. Bryant Jenkins, indicating her neighborhood support. And then we also have a letter from the Preservation Society indicating that they support this application as well. And that concludes our presentation.
City recommends approval. Ms. Ashby, is there any opposition?
No, Mr. Robinson, no opposition.
Are there any questions from the board? Mr.
I
Bennett.
just had
moves
one
to-
question. I have one question for Lee. So it did say retail, not restaurant use, right?
Correct.
So is-
Retail use.
Okay.
Anything else? Mr. Bennett moves for approval, seconded by Mr. Morrison. All in favor signify by saying aye. Mr. Morrison,
Aye.
Mr. Jadon,
Aye.
Ms. Grass,
Aye.
Ms. Richards,
Aye.
Mr. Bennett.
Aye.
Mr. Robinson votes aye. The motion is unanimously approved. Next item on the agenda is number 6, 186 St. Philip Street, Canberra, Elliott Borough. Request a variance from section 54-301 to allow construction of 2 residential units, duplex, with 1,554.5 square feet of lot area per dwelling unit, 2,000 square feet required. Request a special exception under 54-511 to allow 2 residential units, 2nd and 3rd floors, and a restaurant use, 1st floor, with 790 square feet of inside patron use area without providing required off-street parking spaces, 9 spaces required, zone general business. Mr. Batchelder.
So here's another property in Canberra, Elliott Borough. This one has a different history to it. This is a corner property, corner of St. Philip and Cannon Street. And it's commercially zoned, actually zoned general business in this location. And the building that's been sitting in this location on this property for many years is a dilapidated building that has been pretty much in the same state as long as I can remember, and goes back, many years. And so now we have a applicant who is proposing to demolish this building. It's not historic. Demolish the building and build back something that would be more typical of what you would find on a commercially zoned corner property in this neighborhood. And and again, we have a request that involves parking because the building as it currently sits on the property has no room for parking, and the proposal is to not provide parking either because it's just not an appropriate type of use along Cannon Street on this property. It's not a very large property, as you can see, and so it's not really suited to having off-street parking on it. And if you were to put off-street parking on this property, it would be probably a little bit unsafe for access, given the traffic on Cannon and St. Philip. And also, you wouldn't end up getting much parking on site, and you'd have to remove parking probably on the street or impact on-street parking in order to put those driveways in place. So it doesn't really make sense, doesn't lend itself to having any off-street parking, given those constraints. Here's the application, explanation, survey of the property. So we'll get right to it. So here are plans that show the proposed building on the site. They would have a ground floor restaurant space and kitchen, and then access to residential units upstairs. They would also provide some space back here for the trash and things like that, which is appropriate and important to provide. And then on the second floor, you see there would be the living space associated with 2 residential units. Third floor would be the bedrooms associated with those units. And then on the roof, they would have a small area that would be accessible. And these are just conceptual plans showing what this building might look like. It will, of course, have to go through the Board of Architectural Review and be approved by that board. But these are just illustrations of that 3-story building. And the back view, east elevation. And this would be the north elevation, Cannon Street elevation. Another view here of the south elevation. And, image of what that might look like. And then a letter from Marion Hawkins, the president of the Cannon Borough Elliott Borough Neighborhood Association, indicating that they reviewed the plans at their March meeting, and stating that they like it because it will activate the long neglected street corner and replace a derelict building. The small lot presents significant challenges to development due to the fact that this development is at an entrance corridor and represents an important corner. The neighborhood association voted to support both variances, the density variance, as well as the parking. So one condition is that the owner work with the neighborhood on noise mitigation measures at the rooftop. And that, my understanding is that the applicant will work with the neighborhood association on coming up with a way and installing whatever that technology is to help monitor and mitigate the impact of noise on that roof. And that's something that they've agreed to do with the neighborhood association. So with that condition, they strongly encourage the board to approve the request. And I feel like this is a really exciting opportunity to finally have a redevelopment of this corner. This property has been sitting here, and I don't know that we've ever seen anybody actually get to the point of making an application where they were able to get it under contract and move forward with something. So it's really exciting to see this corner finally have a proposal that is being put forward, and we think it's an appropriate use, very typical of the corner store, corner commercial uses in that neighborhood. And so we recommend approval.
Committee recommends approval. Ms. Ashby, is there any opposition?
No, Mr. Robinson, no opposition.
Any questions from the board?
I just had one question. Is that in the district that is where short-term rentals are allowed? Is that in part of the?
Yes,
So presumably this would be probably short-term rentals, the units above. Which is why I think it would be certainly very important that those rooftop noise mitigation, I think that should be something that's in our approval.
right.
Mr. Batchel, in the application is no mention of rooftop use.
Well, so you see the plans here that include these stairs that provide access between the living level and the bedroom level. They extend all the way up onto the roof to provide access to the roof, where each residential unit would have access to its own portion of the roof. And and the plans clearly show that as part of the residential units. And those residential units, because of the location within that neighborhood, can be, assuming they're approved, would be able to be converted into short-term rental units. And so I think the applicant, the neighborhood, I think, I don't want to speak for them, but I believe that they were just excited to see something come forward from somebody who's done quality work in that neighborhood, and wanted to see this project move forward, and agreed that they would be supportive with that condition about working with the neighborhood on the noise mitigation on the roof. And I contacted both the neighborhood president to understand what they were talking about.
Mhm.
I got the letter and the applicant, and they both are on the same page about how to deal with that, I believe. And I know the applicant is on the call in case you have any questions for him or his architect, Ashley Jennings.
Any questions from the board? Any motions?
I move for approval.
Move for approval by Mr. Judon. Is there a second?
Second,
Second by Mr. Morrison. All in favor, signify by saying,
Does that include that condition about the applicant working with the neighborhood association on noise mitigation measures?
Yes.
Thank you.
all in favor, signify by saying aye. Mr. Morrison,
aye.
Mr. Judon,
Aye.
Ms. Grass,
Aye.
Ms. Richards,
Aye.
Mr. Bennett.
Aye.
Mr. Robinson votes aye. The motion is unanimously approved. Item number 7, 330 West Confederate Circle, South Windermere. Request a special exception under section 54-110 to allow a one-story addition, kitchen, expansion, dining room that extends the non-conforming 7-foot south side setback 9 feet required, zone SR1.
So 330 West Confederate Circle is an existing home in South Windermere. And it's a one-story house, and you'll see that image in just a minute. This is the location of the property. Aerial view, zoning map, application survey. So here's an illustration that very clearly illustrates what they're proposing to do. So the green outline is the existing building footprint on the lot. And you can see that this corner encroaches into that 9-foot setback line, which is shown here with the red line. And it is 7 feet off of the neighboring side property line. So that existing house already has a 7-foot setback to that corner. And what they are proposing to do is build this addition on the back of the property. And again, the back corner of that proposed addition would have a 7-foot setback consistent with the existing house, 7-foot side setback. So the request is for a special exception to allow a one-story addition to extend that non-conforming 7-foot setback on that east, or I guess it's the south side. Just an enlargement of that. So this is the existing front elevation on the top and the side elevation on that right side down here. This is a carport right now. And the proposed elevation shows that the conditioned living space is being enlarged to occupy what was the carport area over here. And then the addition that would be constructed is located back here. It's basically a dining room addition and covered porch back here. And they've spoken to neighbors and obtained letters of support. This is a special exception, so it's an issue of light and air impacts. And the house is really not that large in its existing configuration. Again, this is the existing floor plan. And their additions are proposed to enlarge the living space, still keeping the parking. But because it's a one-story house, you know, there's limited opportunities for how you do that. And this seems like a very appropriate way to expand the house a little bit and make it fit in. So the changes will not dramatically change the appearance of the house. And I really don't think there'll be any impact on the neighboring property. Nobody has expressed any opposition or concerns to this request. And we have those letters of support as well from some immediate neighbors. So our recommendation is for approval.
City recommends approval and there's no opposition. Are there any questions from the board? Motion for approval made by Mr. Morrison, seconded by Mr. Judon. All in favor signify by saying aye. Mr. Morrison,
Aye.
Mr. Judon,
Aye.
Mr. Rass,
Aye.
Ms. Richards,
Aye.
Mr. Bennett,
Aye.
Mr. Robinson votes aye. The motion is unanimously approved. That completes the agenda.
And
Thank you all very much.
And by the way, this is Chairman Robinson's last meeting, and I just want to thank him for all his many years of service on the board.
Joining that, thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank
God
you.
bless you. God bless you.
Thank you. I wish
You'll
we
be
were
missed.
able to have open meetings these past couple of years to be able to get to speak to y'all in person a little more often, but I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think the board's done a wonderful job, and it was my honor to be involved with you.
You've been an excellent chairman.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you,
And-
Mike.
And so our next meeting, it will be in person back at 2 George Street. And looking forward to seeing everybody in person again. And we're starting off our first in-person meeting tomorrow with the Planning Commission, and then proceeding with the BAR meetings and DRB meeting, and then our Board of Zoning Appeals that first week of April. So we'll send more information about that. Of course, we have parking passes, just like we used to do. We'll have parking passes for all the board members who would like to park in the parking garage here at the Gill Yard. And we'll give you those to you at the meeting, and then, you know, you can get out of the garage for free, so you don't have to worry about parking. But yes, that is the plan, and we are gearing up for that, and we look forward to seeing everybody in person on April 5th.
Wow.
I'm jealous.
Oh,
You can
Mike, I
always
assume-
visit, Mr. Robinson.
I assume you would come back
Yeah.
for the entertainment.
We'll miss you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank
Thank
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you
you.
all.
God bless.
Thanks,